Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. One of the things that always drew me to the Star Wars universe was how familiar it was. They are plagued with the same daily problems that we face in our own galaxy, just on a larger scale. They have refugee crises, political scandals, environmental disasters, and extreme religious cults, just like we do. But perhaps one of the most interesting ways in which Star Wars reflects our own world is through the various governments that inhabit it. And today I want to start a series that examines the various types of Star Wars governments through the political lens of our own world, starting off with the Galactic Empire. In order to talk about the political leanings of the Empire, we'll be using this chart from the Political Compass organization. The northern and southern extremes of the compass represent authoritarian and libertarian governments. Authoritarian governments have a heavy control over their populace. Real-life examples would be Nazi Germany or the Chinese Communist Party. Libertarian governments, on the other hand, have limited control over their populace. There aren't many modern examples of libertarian governments, but one example that has been commonly used is the coalition of American colonies during the 18th century. The western and eastern extremes of the compass represent planned economies versus free markets. A planned economy would be a socialist economy and feature heavy regulations, like North Korea. Free market would be a capitalist economy that has little to no regulation, like Hong Kong. So keeping all of that in mind, let's discuss the history of the Empire and how it governed. During the waning months of the Clone Wars, the Galactic Empire was created by Chancellor Palpatine after an assassination attempt by the Jedi faction. The Jedi were the leaders and generals of the army, and their attempted coup was devastating for the Republic, which was in the middle of a brutal siege in the Outer Rim territories against the Separatist alliance. In order to assure the loyalty of the Jedi-led clone army, the Chancellor was given additional emergency executive powers, including direct control over the Grand Army of the Republic as the Commander-in-Chief of all Republic forces. His first move was to purge the Jedi generals and everyone in their faction. This is similar to what Stalin did after the murder of fellow Soviet leader Sergei Kirov. Stalin cracked down on dissidents within his own party and imposed strict legislations to disarm party members. It's rumored that Stalin himself orchestrated the murder of Kirov to allow him to carry out his purge. Palpatine was especially adept at using these types of false flag attacks to gather political support. He secretly created the Separatist alliance and used the Clone Wars to expose weakness in the Republic. As Separatist soldiers began marching on Republic worlds, Palpatine exploited the public's fear with his militaristic populist rhetoric. Our own leaders have used similar tactics. While they haven't relied specifically on false flag attacks, they have used questionable intel to propel the country into war. Like the report of WMDs in Iraq that started the invasion of Iraq post 9/11, or the Gulf of Tonkin incident which caused an escalation in Vietnam in the 60s. In response to the escalating galactic civil war, the Senate acquiesced power to Palpatine, understanding that the Republic was too bogged down in politics and bureaucracy to effectively combat the Separatist threat, which isn't unlike the emergency powers that American leaders like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and even FDR obtained during moments in American history where the sovereignty and survival of the nation was in question. Luckily for our country, these leaders also peacefully gave up their power. Well, actually only George Washington did. I mean, FDR died in his third term in office, and Abe Lincoln was assassinated by a pro-slavery vampire. And even though these great American leaders were able to preserve the very systems they had overstepped, they were also able to use their wartime powers to achieve great things. Through years of careful maneuvering and plotting, Palpatine was able to slowly erode the powers of the other branches of government until he was finally able to declare a new order and appoint himself the Emperor of the newly founded Galactic Empire. In the months following the declaration of the new order, the Separatist alliance was defeated, giving another big popularity boost to the Empire. Years later, shortly after the Battle of Scarif, the Senate was completely disbanded and the last remnant of the Republic disappeared along with any ability to balance and check the Emperor. Although arguably those powers disappeared a long time ago along with any public dissidents. The Galactic Empire during this period became a galactic dictatorship, with one man at the top of the organization who had supreme power and had his mandate carried out by several regional governors and moths. The Galactic Empire was built on a promise of bringing peace and stability to the galaxy. And that meant a fundamental part of the Emperor's plan revolved around its military. The Imperial Navy, Stormtrooper Corps, and Army were the tools with which Emperor Palpatine used to control his massive territory. It was successful at putting down rebellions and keeping space lanes free of piracy, but more importantly, the Imperial military was one of the largest employers in the galaxy. As any great leader knows, a massive amount of unemployed people, especially men who are at a military serving age, poses a significant threat to the government. If that certain demographic isn't given menial labor jobs that give them just about enough money to buy some booze so that they can forget about their crappy jobs, they'll start hanging out with their other unemployed friends on street corners, and before you know it, they'll be throwing rocks and eventually Molotov cocktails at stormtroopers. The Empire used the military to effectively replace institutions and services that would otherwise be provided by the government. On some smaller colonies and planets, the Imperial military was basically the only federal presence on world. For people on these more isolated planets with limited economic development, joining the Imperial military was considered one of the best options for an education and one of the few ways they could actually get off-world. On more developed planets, a high military posting came with political power as well as economic benefits from businesses seeking lucrative military contracts. Imperial academies quickly replaced schools, and large percentage of the workforce was shifted from other industries to work for the military or military-industrial complex. The Empire's economic policy was also very controlled. They nationalized many different resources. In order to ensure that they could continue to afford expanding their military, the Empire took over many of the arms, munitions, and ship construction companies, allowing them to decrease defense spending, while at the same time creating massive amounts of jobs in the military-industrial complex. Even when cash was tight, the Empire had also nationalized the banks, which allowed them to print more currency if necessary. Palpatine had carried out a hostile takeover of the banking clans way before the Republic had even fallen. What Palpatine had created was a massive organization dedicated to enforcing his will. At the same time, it was also one of the largest employers and economic engines in the galaxy. It was actually a brilliant plan and very self-sustainable. With a large percentage of your populace working for the government, that meant the government had more control over the populace. After all, jobs and wages have a huge effect on how we live our lives. It affects where we live, the type of people we hang out with, and our political views. If your livelihood is directly connected with strong government spending, well, you're more inclined to support your government. Although it's not directly mentioned, we can assume that the Empire levied many different restrictions and tariffs to regulate trade, which made the galaxy a lucrative place for smugglers to operate in. The Empire also played around with some fascist ideologies. Members of society who weren't a part of the military or military-industrial complex were considered second-class citizens, especially if you were alien scum, #humanity first. Most benefits, whether it be pensions, housing, or healthcare, were only given to individuals who were public servants. Like in many fascist systems, if you were a part of the system, life was great. But if you weren't a part of the system or had some pre-existing condition which made you unable to participate in that system, life was terrible. The Empire was a tale of two worlds. Already affluent core worlds became richer, and oftentimes were the ones who benefited from the Galactic Empire's consolidation of major industries, because most of these nationalized companies ended up staying in the core worlds. In the Outer Rim, far from prying eyes, entire worlds were strip mined for resources to drive the Empire's industrial might, allowing for incredible engineering projects like the Death Star to come to fruition. Protected worlds during the Republic era, considered too precious to commercialize because of their natural beauty or historical and religious significance, were opened up for mining corporations and other heavy industries. The massive planned economy of the Empire drove the massive authoritarian fist of Emperor Palpatine. But despite his best attempts, the Empire wasn't anywhere near as authoritarian as the Emperor had planned. This was mainly due to the enormous amount of territory the Empire spanned across. Only the largest and most populous systems were lucky enough to have even a light cruiser, let alone an entire Star Destroyer and attachment of stormtroopers. Most planets were just left unguarded and self-governed, with just occasional visits from Imperial patrols or representatives. This is why the rebellion always had places to hide and friends ready to help their cause. In that way, the Empire was much less like 1984 or the North Korean dictatorship, and more like the classical empires of Rome and Britain, with a strong, prosperous core and many different satellite colonies and tributaries that answered to the Empire, but for the most part were self-governed. That's why on an authoritarian to libertarian scale, the Empire is just a few notches away from being completely authoritarian. It was simply too massive to be controlled. The same could be said about the imperial economy. While the military industry was highly subsidized and controlled by the government, and a strong central bank controlled the financial world, depending where you were in the Empire, there were many different types of planetary economies that were less affected by imperial policies. So the imperial economy on a scale of planned economy to free trade would be closer to the middle, but skewing towards more of a planned economy. Well guys, that is our political breakdown of the Galactic Empire. I think it's a really interesting case study simply because we've never seen a government at the scale of the Galactic Empire. The Empire is so massive, and how governments function at the scale of nations can be completely different when scaled up to an entire galaxy. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe, like us on Facebook, so you don't miss out on our next episode in the series where British Ben, who actually hails from Hong Kong, will be breaking down the Mercantile Separatist Alliance or Confederacy of Independent Systems. Well, guys, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.